Today we'll be learning about the Great Depression. This lesson will be focusing on South Carolina Social Studies Standard 5-4.2. In this lesson we will be looking at the causes of the Great Depression and other things such as the Dust Bowl and the effects of the stock market crash of 1929. If you'll record this in your Social Studies interactive notebook, that'll give you the ability to set up the next section of notes. The stock market crash of 1929 marked the end of the economic boom of the 1920s and the start of the Great Depression of the 1930s. However, the stock market crash was not the only factor that contributed to the Depression. It simply exposed the economic weaknesses of the United States. The Depression itself does not get very bad for people living in the United States until later, over into the next year, actually, into 1930. Things start to bounce back just a little bit after the stock market crashes with the major selling of stocks by consumers, but then what ends up happening is the failure of the banks and many other things in our society in the United States take place. So things that are important in this lesson to keep in mind to think about is that the stock market crashes of 1929 marked the end of that economic boom of the 1920s that we discussed in the last unit of study. The stock market crash was not the only factor that contributed to the Depression. So we're going to talk about what some of those other causes are. So causes of the Great Depression included consumer spending and the booming stock market. If you'll remember back, in the 1920s, people began buying things on credit. We talked about things like the automobile and a lot of luxuries items. They were spending more than they made and living beyond their means. So investors were buying stocks that were growing quickly, even though the companies weren't worth as much as they seemed. The stocks for companies would be going up, and it would look like the companies were worth a lot of money, but they actually were not worth the amount that the stocks looked like. So a lot of people spending money and living beyond their means, so more money than they could actually pay. So people were buying a lot more than they could afford. Then the decline in industry and overproduction, factories were producing more goods than poor consumers were buying. The high tariffs placed on foreign goods meant we weren't selling goods overseas either. So factories laid off workers or lowered their wages, which resulted in poorer families who couldn't buy the goods being produced. Remember, in the last unit of the study, we talked about how when a lot of something was produced, the price would drop. And this, for instance, worked very well for the automobile with Ford because they were able to produce a lot of Model Ts and the price dropped so more people could buy them. But at a certain point, once people buy the item, then they don't need to buy another one. A lot of families would buy just one automobile. Well, once they bought their one automobile, then they didn't need to buy another one. So this caused for problems of overproduction, producing too much stuff. And then farming was another issue that kind of led to a cause of the Great Depression, that the effects of drought and poor farming techniques over time meant that less goods were being produced and then even more poorer families. So you kind of see that people during the 20s were producing and making a lot of things either on farms or in factories, but the 30s is going to lead away into the opposite effect in our country. The stock market crash of 1929 was when investors recognized that the economy was slowing. So people were starting to spend less money because their own finances were dropping. They had less money themselves. They suddenly began selling off their stocks. This sale was made worse because some investors had borrowed in order to buy stocks. So they had actually borrowed money to buy stocks. They could not pay off their loans as the value of the stocks declined. So then the stock market crashes and people are sitting at one point very wealthy, as it appears, and then the opposite. They could be completely broke after the stock market crash if they had invested a lot of money, especially money they didn't have, if they had borrowed money to buy those stocks. So things on this page is that you could go through, and I would be sure that I list the causes of the Great Depression. I would list consumer spending in the booming stock market, farming, declining industry and overproduction, and stock market crash of 1929. Then the other words on the screen I would summarize into my own words so that I knew what it meant later, so that you could remember what these causes were. Now there were other things to think about, and we're going to look at these causes all in a different way here, kind of like a domino effect. So first off, we have businesses lay off workers. So when they're laying off workers, those people are unemployed, so they're unable to buy things. So when they're unable to buy things, businesses lay off more workers because they're not selling the goods that they once were selling, so they have a limited amount of ability to hire people. And then unemployed people cannot pay off bank loans. So if you owe money to the bank and you can't pay the loan, then what's going to happen? Well, the loss of confidence in banking system causes people to try and withdraw all their money. So after the stock market crash, people go to the banks and try to pull their money out. This causes the banks to, with limited payments coming in, they can't pay their depositors. People aren't paying their loans back to the banks, and so they don't have the money to be able to pay out to the people who had put the money in the bank in the first place. So then we have something called runs on the banks, and this causes the bank failures. Lots and lots of banks have to close very quickly because they don't have the money to pay out to the depositors. People with money saved in the bank didn't have money anymore. So you had deposited your money in the bank for safekeeping, only to find that your money was not really safe. So what happens is during this time period is that many African Americans, and we're going to kind of go back into something we talked about before here, many African Americans had begun to migrate northward in the early 1900s to combat the depressed farm economy and prejudice in the South. Additional Americans began to migrate from their farms to find jobs during the Depression. Unfortunately, most did not find the employment opportunities they sought. Homeless people began to build makeshift homes out of scrap lumber and empty boxes in parks and other public places. These shanty towns came to be called Hoovervilles, named after President Herbert Hoover. So what happens is, remember going back to the Great Migration in our previous unit, you have other people that also try to do this. Not just African Americans, but you have white farmers who try to go into the cities because they lose their farms, because they're not able to grow crops, they can't pay their bills. So then what takes place is lots of people that are homeless. And a lot of these people are set up outside of major cities. On this would be a page that I would summarize into my own words. You may want to definitely remember the point that additional Americans began to migrate. And the reason they did this was to find jobs during the Depression, and jobs that weren't there for them. Another issue of the time period was something called the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl was a time period in our country, and what we think of as the Dust Bowl was when farmers had used very poor farming techniques and the crops drained the soils of nutrients. And then there was periods of drought. So the Midwest of our country really becomes what is best coined as a dust bowl, in that they weren't able to grow crops. Massive windstorms would blow the soil, and the storms would be so thick that you couldn't see. Well, the Dust Bowl conditions in the Midwest led others, such as the Okies, to migrate to California, where they sought jobs as migrant workers. Many unemployed young men and some young women took to the highways or rode the rails from town to town seeking work or a handout and became known as hobos. So, off of this page, this would be another page to summarize. You can think about what the Dust Bowl was. And what I would keep in mind is that many people even migrated to California, just like they had migrated to the north, as we talked about with African Americans before and white farmers. Because what were they wanting to do? Well, they went to California where they sought jobs as migrant workers. Many unemployed young men and some young women took to the highways or rode the rails from town to town seeking work or a handout and became known as hobos. So these people traveling during the time, lots of people staying on the move trying to find work because they're trying to find a way to provide for their family.